Hi everybody, Mr. Lynch here. I've got a topic for you today, the Panic of 1837. And I didn't want to just give this to you in a handout because one, this is really complicated information, and two, for many of you, this is going to change your journal character's life forever and not in a good way. So I thought I'm going to try to do this in about 15 minutes, explain all this. The good thing is you don't have to take notes on this. I'll have a handout for you afterwards, but this will get at a lot of stuff that you're going to want to know. So this is kind of how money worked back then. Right now we're about the year 1836, 1837. So first of all, back then there was not actually any money like we have nowadays. There was not, the national government, did not have any paper money like this. Okay, so what did people use for money? Well, in a lot of places, like the more rural areas, they didn't use money at all. A lot of them just did barter, which is trade. I'll trade you a bushel of wheat in exchange for a barrel of molasses that you have, or goose feathers, and they would just do exchange that way. Or they'd exchange labor that they did. Another way that people used money, well, the best form of money back then was what they called specie. I wrote it up there. Specie means actual gold or silver, like the real metal. And it didn't matter what shape it was in, whether it was a coin shape or a nugget or even dust. Anytime you walk into a store, they'd have a balance on the counter, and there was a certain value of gold or silver per ounce. They would weigh it out, and that's how you could pay for stuff. And everybody loves gold or silver. It was like the real deal. But obviously, there's a limited amount of that. And so, what also then people used for money were called banknotes. They kind of look like money today, but they were printed out and put out by the banks, the banks themselves, like the Andover Savings Bank or the National Bank. And so when you we've talked about people borrowed money from the bank, this is the form in which they borrow it. If you borrowed $100, the bank would give you a $100 banknote, or $5, $20 banknotes from their bank. And then you could go use those banknotes just like money. Okay, so if I was buying a new plow, I could go to the blacksmith or the plow maker and pay him with those banknotes. And now he could use those banknotes just like money. Now, the reason people trusted these banknotes is anybody that held that banknote, you could take it back to the bank at any time and exchange it for actual gold or silver. Okay, so that plow manufacturer could take the $100 banknote and go to the bank and get $100 of actual gold for it. So that's why people were willing to accept these bank notes as money, because they kind of just represented actual gold or silver. Okay, so here's how this works then. Now let's get into Andrew Jackson. Okay, so here's a little diagram up here, a little history math. And so, for example, banks had certain rules. And the National Bank, this is before Jackson kills it off, the National Bank basically set the rules for all the banks in the country. And so, for example, let's say the National Bank had $10,000 of specie deposited in the bank. So people could deposit their gold or silver in the bank, right? The bank would keep it safe for them, right? And that gives that bank that certain amount of gold and silver in the bank. National Bank had a rule called a 50% specie reserve rate. Don't worry, but here's what it means, okay? If they had $10,000 in actual gold or silver in the bank, they had to have 50% of whatever paper notes they printed up backed up by actual gold. So the National Bank could loan out, in this example, $20,000 in paper notes of the National Bank paper notes, because they got 50% of that backed up with actual specie. Well, let's take your little local bank, your Andover Savings Bank or whatever. Of course, they don't have nearly as much specie in their bank, but they still had to keep a 50% reserve rate. So you can see, therefore, if we do the math, the Andover Savings Bank could only loan out $200 in paper notes. And they're not real happy about that because, right, we know banks make their money by loaning out money and getting the interest. This is why Andrew Jackson hated the National Bank, because everyday people couldn't borrow from it. And they kept this pretty strict reserve rate, so the little banks couldn't loan out money. So you know what Andrew Jackson did, right? He kills the National Bank, right? Kills it, okay? When he does that, now the smaller banks, okay, they want to loan out more money. So what do? They drop their specie reserve rate. And now you can see, by doing that, now they only have to have 10% of their paper notes backed out. Now they could loan out $1,000, this little bank. But, right, even more than this, when Jackson kills the national bank, he takes its specie that belonged to the national government, right, and he distributes it to different local banks. Okay, so let's say, just for this example, okay, he gives $900 of this to the Andover Savings Bank. Now they've got $1,000 in specie using 10%. Now they can loan out $10,000. They used to be able to loan out $200. Now they can loan out $10,000. And this is exactly what you were writing about this week. There are a lot more little banks loaning out a lot more money than ever before. And people are loving this. People are borrowing money for everything, okay? To buy new machinery, to expand their factory, to build a house, to buy more seeds, and most importantly, to buy a lot more land, okay? But you can probably guess what the problem is going to be, right? Remember, anyone who's holding a paper note at any point in time can go back to the bank and get their actual gold and silver. And I bet you can see the problem, okay? Well, the problem is something called inflation. The more paper money that's out in the economy, prices go up, right? Because people have more money to spend, so therefore sellers charge more money, right? You guys, we're probably seeing the opposite right now with the coronavirus, right? Where prices are dropping because people are losing their jobs, they don't have as much money, so sellers have to lower their prices. But now, back here, there was massive inflation. And people were selling stuff, they were getting paid with these paper banknotes, okay, that didn't really have a lot backing them up. And people were getting really worried about all the paper banknotes out there in the economy. In particular, the national government was getting really worried, okay? Because people were buying a lot of land from the national government with these inflated paper notes. So what does the government and Andrew Jackson do? Andrew Jackson issues something called the Specie Circular, which says, okay, the national government will only accept will only accept actual specie in payment for land. They will no longer accept banknotes. Well, you can probably imagine the message this sends to people, right? People are saying, whoa, the national government is not going to accept banknotes anymore, then I better get specie. And of course, other sellers are saying, wait, if the national government doesn't want to get banknotes, I don't want to be paying banknotes either. Pay me with specie. So all of a sudden now, the national government and other people want specie. So you can imagine the people are going to go back to the bank now to turn their banknotes into specie, and the banks don't have it. The banks don't have it. And it becomes a massive, not just people go to the bank, people run to the bank because it's kind of first come, first serve. And the banks don't have the money. They don't have the specie there. And so there's more of a panic. They literally called it the Panic of 1837. People start going to their banks, and their banks don't have the money. And so their banks shut down, their banks split apart, they rupture, hence the term bankrupt, okay? And now people that thought they had money, right, either banknotes, the banknotes aren't worth anything anymore because the bank that put them out doesn't exist. And people that had their specie in the bank, it's probably gone, right? Probably given out to one of the first people that got there. And this causes a massive economic crash. I mean, you've all probably heard of the Great Depression in the 1930s. This was the biggest panic up until the Great Depression. The American economy just crashes in 1837 because once people don't have money, then they stop buying things. So the people who make goods now have fewer people buying them, so they start laying off employees, and those employees don't get a paycheck. So they stop buying things, right? So other businesses go out of business, they lay off their employees. It's this nasty cycle that just goes on and on, okay? And thus it's this huge panic that impacts almost everyone in the economy back then, okay? I'll give you a fact sheet that tells you the data about different jobs that were hit, okay? And I'll go over that with some of you for the journal project, okay? But you can imagine, like the first businesses to go out of business are the factories that make cloth and clothing, because if people are in an economic crisis, a panic, they're not going out to buy new clothes. They're just going to get by with their old clothes. 90% of the factories in the East will go out of business. Okay, merchants go out of business. You can imagine all the people that get impacted by this. If there's basically no money, and any banknotes you're holding on to, okay, are pretty much worthless. Okay. So for the journal project, right, these are the rules. If you had money deposited in a bank, you lost it all. You did not get there in time. If you own a factory or worked in a factory, your factory goes out of business. Okay. The only people that don't get impacted much by this is your everyday poor farmer that just grew his or her own stuff and just lived off their farm. They didn't really buy or sell anything. Pretty much everyone else gets massively impacted by this. Okay, so you want to play out and think about this, and this is going to make for some really powerful journal writing. But here's the thing, here's the rule about this. Don't try to escape this devastating impact of the panic. It's a time for you to do some really thoughtful, powerful writing. Okay, so do not miraculously escape the panic. You're not going to be walking down the street one day and you trip and stumble and look, oh, there's a gold nugget, right? I just tripped over it and found it. None of that, right? You didn't have an uncle you never knew die and left you $1 million in his will. Don't do any of that stuff, okay? In fact, it's a great time to think about, right? There are millions of people, right, in our society today that lack money, that lack a job, okay, who are really struggling to get by. It's an experience to think about their position. So what are you going to need to do? Well, anything you can to survive, right? You've probably lost your house. If you had a mortgage on your house, you don't have money, you can't pay it back, right? The banks will seize your property. You might have to move in with relatives, right? You do anything you can to scrape together some pennies. You try to earn maybe 5 or 6 different jobs. Probably have to pull your kids out of school so they can try to earn some pennies. Whatever it takes, okay, is what you need to get by. There'll be a chance for you to ask me a lot of questions, both on Zoom and by email. But this is just the information you need to know for now. Thanks, and good luck, everyone.